Good evening, and welcome back to Quiet Historians. There is a particular kind of historical tragedy that does not announce itself with the sound of falling walls or the sight of retreating armies. Most civilizations fall eventually, and the falling, however dramatic, is rarely the most interesting thing about them. But when a civilization is deliberately and comprehensively unmade, when the victors go beyond conquest to erasure, when they burn not just the buildings but the books, not just the soldiers but the memory, then something different has occurred, something that history struggles to account for. Because the accounting itself has been tampered with. That is the tragedy of Carthage. And it makes tonight's story unlike almost anything else we tell here. Because we are navigating a double darkness. The darkness of a civilization that was, by any honest measure, genuinely extraordinary. One that at its height commanded the Western Mediterranean with a commercial and military reach that no other power could match. And then the additional, deeper darkness of the fact that almost nothing we know about it came from Carthaginians themselves. We are learning about Carthage from Rome, from the civilization that feared it, fought it across a century and a half of brutal war, and ultimately burned it to the ground. According to the most enduring tradition, Rome did not merely destroy Carthage, it salted the earth where the city had stood, so that nothing would ever grow there again. Whether that detail is literally true, and scholars have debated it for generations, it captures something emotionally precise about what Rome intended. This was not defeat, this was deletion, and the deletion was so thorough that the Punic perspective on its own history, the Carthaginian account of who they were and what they believed and why they fought, has been almost entirely lost. What survived the burning survived because Rome chose to preserve it, which means what survived was what Rome found useful or unthreatening. Everything else, the histories, the religious texts, the literature, the philosophy of an entire civilization that had been literate for centuries, turned to ash in 146 BCE and has never been recovered. We are therefore in the position of trying to understand one of the ancient world's great powers almost entirely through the eyes of its destroyers. That is not a footnote to tonight's story. It is the story. Rome and Carthage fought 3 wars across approximately 120 years, and the outcome of those wars hung in genuine balance at several points. Points where, if a single battle had gone differently, if a single decision had been made another way, the history of the Mediterranean world and everything that flowed from it would have been fundamentally altered. At the height of the Second Punic War, with Hannibal Barca's army encamped within sight of the walls of Rome, having already destroyed 3 Roman armies and crossed the Alps with war elephants in one of the most audacious military operations in the ancient world, the possibility of a Carthaginian victory was not fantasy. It was close enough to reality that historians and military theorists have been arguing about it ever since. The world in which Carthage won, in which the Western Mediterranean became a Punic lake, in which the Semitic commercial culture of the Phoenician diaspora rather than the Latin military culture of the Roman Republic shaped the subsequent civilization of Europe, is one of the most persistently imagined alternatives in counterfactual history. And for good reason. It was very nearly the world that actually happened. The margin between the world we have and the world we almost had was measured, at certain moment, in single afternoons, in individual decisions, in the particular stubbornness of a Senate that refused to negotiate even when every rational calculation said it should. So before we go any further, find a comfortable position. Let the room settle around you. Let your breath slow. There is a long story ahead, and it deserves the attention of a quiet night. We are going back, all the way back, to a city on the coast of North Africa that was, for the better part of 6 centuries, one of the most consequential places in the world. A city built by refugees on a strip of land between 2 seas. A city whose founders cut an ox hide into the thinnest possible strips to claim the ground beneath their feet. A city that would build the greatest commercial empire the ancient world had ever seen, produce one of history's supreme military commanders, and then be burned so completely that even the ground it stood on was cursed. A city whose language, whose gods, whose alphabet, whose very way of understanding the world was systematically erased. And yet, somehow, incompletely, because the stone remembers, even when the text has burned. The harbour basin still holds its ancient shape beneath the modern city of Tunis. The hill where the citadel once stood is still there, and the alphabet the Phoenicians carried to Carthage, the script that Hannibal used to write his dispatches, is the direct ancestor of the letters you are reading right now. Some things survive the fire. Tonight, we try to find them. The city that would become Carthage was founded, according to the ancient tradition that both Roman and later sources preserved, by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre on the coast of what is now Lebanon, sometime in the late 9th century BCE. The conventional date given is 814 BCE, though the archaeological evidence has been somewhat more ambiguous about the precise founding moment than the literary tradition would prefer. What the sources agree on, what they transmit with the consistency that suggests a story told and retold across many generations, is the legend of Dido, Elissa in the Phoenician version of the tradition, a Tyrian princess who fled the court of her brother Pygmalion after he murdered her husband for his wealth, taking with her a group of Tyrian nobles and their followers, crossing the Mediterranean to the coast of North Africa, and there negotiating with the local Berber king Iarbas for as much land as could be covered by a single ox hide. What happened next is the detail that made the story worth remembering. Dido did not lay the ox hide flat. She cut it into the thinnest possible strips and laid them end to end, enclosing enough ground to build a citadel. The citadel she raised on the promontory jutting into the Bay of Tunis was called Bursa, a word meaning both citadel and, in a Greek pun the tradition lovingly preserved, hide. Around the Bursa, the city of Carthage grew. The legend of Dido is exactly the kind of founding myth that ancient cities produced and ancient peoples needed. A story that explains the origin of a name, establishes the character of the founders through a single defining act, and provides enough human drama to survive generations of retelling. Its specific details are almost certainly legendary rather than historical, but it captures something real, something essential, about what Carthage actually was. The woman at the centre of the story does not win through force. She does not conquer the land or take it by superior numbers. She wins through intelligence, through the precise, lateral thinking of someone who understands that the rules of a negotiation can be reinterpreted without being broken. That is not incidental to the Carthaginian story. It is the Carthaginian story, a civilization built on commercial cunning, on finding the advantage that others have not yet seen, on being always slightly more clever than the situation strictly requires. And the legend chose, notably, to attribute that founding intelligence to a woman, a refugee princess operating in a foreign land with limited resources and unlimited ingenuity. Whatever Carthage was, it began with that image of itself. What the Phoenicians carried to Carthage when they founded it matters as much as the founding itself, and it is worth dwelling on, because the inheritance was extraordinary. They brought the most sophisticated commercial culture in the ancient Mediterranean, a seafaring civilization whose ships had ranged from the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast of Africa and Iberia for centuries, carrying the goods of one world to the markets of another and extracting value from every stage of the journey. They brought gods, Baal Hammon, the sky and weather deity whose worship had developed from earlier Semitic religious traditions, and Tanit, a goddess combining fertility, war, and celestial power, who would become in Carthage perhaps the most important deity in the entire Punic religious world. Hair symbol, a triangular figure with a horizontal bar and a circle resting above it, appears on thousands of votive stelae across the sacred precinct. The tradition calls the Tophet. We will return to the Tophet. It demands more than a passing mention and carries more controversy than almost any other site in ancient archaeology. But for now, What matters is the image of Tanit standing over the city she protected, her symbol carved into stone by people who wanted the goddess to know they had been there. And then there was the alphabet, the Phoenician consonantal alphabet, the ancestor, through various intermediary transformations, of virtually every alphabetic writing system used anywhere in the world today, including the Greek and Latin scripts that eventually transmitted the entire Western literary tradition, and the Aramaic script that gave rise to Hebrew, Arabic, and the writing systems of South and Central Asia, the alphabet that Hannibal used to write his military dispatches, the alphabet that Carthaginian senators used to conduct the business of government, the alphabet that merchants used to record their transactions across a commercial network stretching from the tin islands of Britain to the gold-bearing rivers of West Africa. That alphabet is the direct ancestor of the one carrying these words to you across 25 centuries. That connection is worth sitting with for a moment. The idea that the letters moving through your mind right now are the distant descendants of a script carried westward from Tyre to Carthage by refugees cutting an oxhide into strips on the shore of a continent they had only just arrived on. Civilizations end. The things they carry sometimes do not. The people of Carthage are ash. Their alphabet is very much alive, working quietly in every language that ever learned to write by borrowing the shapes that the Phoenicians first gave to sound. Tonight, as you drift through this story, you are reading it in their letters. That, perhaps more than anything else, is what survived the burning of 146 BCE. Not the libraries, not the histories, not the names of the poets and the priests, but the shapes themselves, still carrying meaning across the full length of recorded time. The geography that Dido chose, whether in legend or in historical memory, was not chosen carelessly. The promontory on the Bay of Tunis offered precisely what a Phoenician colonist with commercial instincts would have immediately recognized as ideal: deep water access on both sides of the peninsula, a defensible position connected to the mainland by only a narrow neck of land, proximity to fertile agricultural valleys behind the coast, and, perhaps most importantly, a position placing the city almost exactly at the geographic centre of the Mediterranean, equidistant from the Strait of Gibraltar to the west and the coast of the Levant to the east, and directly across the water from Sicily, the island that would prove to be both the greatest prize and the greatest source of conflict in the Western Mediterranean world for the next 5 centuries. Dido may be a legend, but the person or people who chose that particular piece of coastline on which to build their city understood geography the way the Phoenicians always understood it, as the primary language of commerce, and commerce as the primary language of power. The harbour that Carthage eventually developed into was one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world, and understanding it physically is the fastest way into understanding what kind of city Carthage actually was. Ancient sources describe 2 distinct harbours separated by a narrow channel, a rectangular commercial harbour where merchant vessels could load and unload their cargo in the continuous, overwhelming rhythm of a city whose wealth depended on movement, and behind it a circular military harbour, the Kothon, whose unique design placed a circular island at the centre, surrounded by a ring of ship berths capable of housing 220 warships simultaneously, with the admiral's headquarters positioned on the central island from which the entire harbour complex could be surveyed at a glance. The commercial and military harbours communicated through the channel between them, and the military harbour connected to the open sea through an entrance that could be sealed with iron chains in times of threat. This harbour complex was not merely infrastructure, it was a physical argument about what Carthage was, a city that understood itself as simultaneously a trading empire and a military power, and that had built the hardware for both into a single engineered landscape at the heart of its urban life. No other city in the ancient Mediterranean had anything quite like it. The double harbour was Carthage made visible, commerce and war, inseparable, facing the sea together. The city that grew around these harbours became, by the 3rd century BCE, one of the largest urban centres in the ancient world, with a population estimated at somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 people. a range that reflects the honest uncertainty of ancient demographic reconstruction. But that establishes clearly enough that Carthage was a city of the first rank by any standard of the period. The harbour front was its commercial heart, and the activity there would have been continuous and overwhelming. Ships from every port in the western Mediterranean tied up at the commercial quays, unloading the goods that made Carthage rich. Silver from Iberia, tin from Britain and Brittany, gold dust from West Africa, grain from Sicily and Sardinia, purple dye from the factories of Tyre, slaves from everywhere. The smell of the harbour district in an ancient Mediterranean port was its own category of sensory experience. Salt water and fish, rotting cargo and ship tar. The particular density of large numbers of people conducting large-scale commerce in close quarters in a warm climate without anything resembling modern sanitation. The commercial quarter that archaeology has revealed in the surviving Punic levels was organised around a street grid, with warehouses and workshops occupying the lower town near the water. The potters whose distinctive red slip ware has been found scattered across the western Mediterranean. The workers in bronze and silver and glass who produced the luxury objects that Carthaginian traders moved through their networks. The artisans whose craft goods travelled further than most ancient people ever did themselves. The city rose behind the harbour in layers of increasing elevation and social significance. The residential blocks, the insulae of the Punic city, were built in a Hellenistic style that reflected the deep Greek cultural influence absorbed by a port city standing at the intersection of every major Mediterranean trade route. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage was not a closed or culturally isolated world. It was the most cosmopolitan city in the western Mediterranean, and its streets would have reflected that with every step. Greek merchants from Syracuse and Corinth, Libyan farmers from the agricultural hinterland bringing produce to market, Iberian miners transporting silver, Numidian horse traders selling the cavalry mounts that were one of North Africa's most prized exports, Egyptian merchants carrying luxury goods from the eastern Mediterranean. All of these moved through the harbour district and the commercial zones of the lower city, conducting their transactions in the multiple languages that Mediterranean trade required. Punic served as the commercial lingua franca of the Western Sea, as Greek did of the Eastern, and the Punic-speaking merchant who could also negotiate in Greek and Libyan and the Iberian languages of the peninsula had the reach that the city's trading empire demanded. Above the commercial quarters, on the heights of the Bursa Hill, stood the great temple of Eshmaun, a healing god, the Punic equivalent of Asclepius, whose sanctuary overlooked the harbour and the bay in the way that elevated sacred spaces always communicated in the ancient world, combining strategic visibility with the symbolism of divine presence watching over the city below. The territory that Carthage controlled extended far beyond the city itself, and by the 3rd century BCE it constituted a genuine empire of the ancient Mediterranean world. The coastal regions of what are now Tunisia and Algeria, significant portions of Morocco, western Sicily and Sardinia, southern Iberia, and a network of scattered commercial stations and colonies stretching across the western Mediterranean all fell within the Carthaginian sphere. This was not an empire in the Roman administrative sense. Carthage did not typically impose direct governance over its subject peoples the way Rome would later do. It was something more commercially sophisticated and, in some respects, more fragile, an empire of networks, in which Carthaginian dominance was maintained through naval superiority, treaty arrangements excluding rivals from specific trading zones, and the collection of tribute from subject peoples who paid for protection rather than submitting to direct rule. The distinction mattered enormously. It produced a form of imperial organisation that was efficient in prosperous times and dangerously dependent on financial credibility in difficult ones. The city's triple landward walls, each standing approximately 30 feet high, with towers at intervals and stabling for horses and elephants built directly into the wall system, defended the landward approaches with a fortification that ancient sources consistently described as among the most formidable in the Mediterranean world. Inside those walls, rising in some areas to 6 stories on the heights of the Bursa, was a city dense with human life, organized by commerce, watched over by its gods, and pointed always, in every aspect of its design and its ambition, toward the sea. What the physical experience of walking through Carthage actually felt like is one of the things most completely erased by the destruction of 146 BCE and by the Roman city built over its foundations. But what archaeology has patiently reconstructed suggests a city of genuine sensory richness, a place where the religious festivals that organized the Carthaginian ritual calendar brought the commercial city together as a community in the way that shared ceremony always has, where the markets offered goods from 3 continents, and where the view from the Bursa Hill on a clear morning would have shown a harbour filled with the sails of ships arriving from every direction the Mediterranean could send them. The women of Carthage are particularly difficult to recover from the available evidence, not because they were absent from Carthaginian life, but because every source that describes the city was produced by cultures that systematically recorded male activity and ignored female experience. What the archaeology shows is that Punic women participated actively in religious life, documented in the votive inscriptions of the Tophet, and the founding legend itself, whatever its historical value, centers entirely on a woman of exceptional intelligence and political capability, the refugee princess who outwitted a king with nothing more than a knife and a piece of leather. Carthage chose to remember itself that way. That choice tells you something about the city that no archaeological survey quite captures. The Carthaginian economy was the engine of everything else the civilization produced, and its specific character distinguished it sharply from both its Phoenician predecessors and its Roman rivals in ways that shaped the entire arc of Punic history. Carthage was, above all and before all, a commercial civilization. The great families whose names appear in the sources, the Barcids, the Magonids before them, the merchant dynasties whose members served as suffetes and senators across generations, were men whose wealth was rooted not in land conquest in the Roman sense, but in trade, in the control of commercial networks, in the revenues extracted from an empire organized around movement and exchange, rather than around the direct exploitation of subject populations through taxation and forced labour alone. The agricultural territory of North Africa that Carthage controlled, the fertile plains of what the Romans would later call Africa Proconsularis, the region of modern Tunisia and northeastern Algeria, was intensively cultivated with a system combining grain production, olive culture, viticulture, and livestock raising in a diversified agricultural economy of remarkable productivity. The Carthaginians developed irrigation systems, introduced new crop varieties, and applied a systematic and scientific approach to land management that the Roman agricultural writers found not merely admirable, but worth preserving at all costs. When the Roman Senate ordered the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, it specifically commanded the preservation and translation into Latin of the agricultural manual of Margot of Carthage, a 28-book work on farming practices considered valuable enough to save even as everything else burned. That single fact tells you something important about the quality of Carthaginian intellectual and practical achievement that the destruction otherwise obscured entirely. The specific exploration achievements of Carthage are among the most remarkable and most debated chapters of its history, and they deserve considerably more than passing mention, because they represent the farthest reach of the Punic commercial imagination, the point at which the merchant's instinct to find new markets merged with the navigator's willingness to sail into genuinely unknown waters. The Periplus, the sailing narrative attributed to a Carthaginian named Hanno, describes a voyage along the West African coast that may have reached as far as modern Sierra Leone or even further south, establishing trading contacts with African coastal peoples and recording natural phenomena, including what appears in the text to be a volcanic eruption visible from the sea, that suggests the voyage was real rather than literary invention. If Hanno's Periplus records genuine exploration, Carthaginian navigators reached sub-Saharan Africa more than 2,000 years before the Portuguese expeditions that European history books credit with the same achievement. The northern parallel to Hanno's southern voyage is the exploration attributed to Hamilcar, another Carthaginian navigator who reportedly sailed northward along the Atlantic coast of Europe, reaching Britain and possibly Ireland and the coast of Brittany. The ancient sources that preserve fragments of Hamilcar's account described fog, seaweed-choked waters, shallow seas, and a sun that seems distant and cold. Observations that read unmistakably like the recorded experience of someone who had actually navigated the North Atlantic, rather than imagined it from the comfort of a Mediterranean harbour. These were not accidental discoveries. They were deliberate commercial expeditions, pushing the boundaries of the known world in search of the tin and the gold and the new trading relationships that sustained Carthaginian commercial dominance. Whether these voyages were conducted as secret intelligence-gathering operations designed to protect Carthaginian monopolies in the Atlantic trade, and there is evidence suggesting that Carthage actively suppressed knowledge of its western routes to exclude Greek and other competitors, or as genuine exploration motivated by commercial curiosity, or as both simultaneously, they represent a maritime ambition and a navigational achievement that Rome never came close to matching. The medieval European explorers who eventually repeated the same routes along the African coast and into the North Atlantic had no knowledge that Carthaginian ships had gone before them. The history of exploration, like so much else, was written by the civilizations that survived long enough to write it, which means the Carthaginian chapters were torn out before the book was finished. But the voyages happened. The fog was real. The volcanic fire on the African shore was real. The cold northern sun over the Tin Islands was real. Hanno and Hamilcar sailed into those waters and came back. And the fact that their accounts survive only as fragments quoted in later sources, stripped of context and detail, is simply one more entry in the long accounting of what was lost when the libraries burned. The commercial philosophy that animated all of this, the voyage, the networks, the agricultural science, the harbour engineering, was one that the Phoenicians had developed and Carthage inherited, extended, and refined into something genuinely distinctive. The insight at its core was that the most valuable commercial position is not that of the producer of goods, but that of the controller of routes, the power that mediates between producers and consumers, extracting value from the movement of things rather than from their creation. Carthage did not mine the silver of Iberia. It organized the networks through which Iberian silver reached the markets that needed it, and it took its percentage at every stage of the journey. It did not grow the grain of Sicily. It controlled the shipping lanes through which Sicilian grain fed the cities of the Mediterranean, and it took its toll at the straits and the harbour mouths. This is the commercial logic of the middleman, elevated to the scale of an empire. The understanding that the network itself is the most valuable thing, more valuable than any single commodity moving through it. It is a logic that is recognizably, almost startlingly, modern. The Carthaginian merchant families who built and maintained that network across centuries were practicing a form of commercial intelligence, knowing where to find what goods, at what price, in exchange for what. That was the true intellectual capital of the Punic world. Its destruction with the city was as complete and as irreversible a loss as the destruction of the libraries. The knowledge of those routes, those relationships, those carefully cultivated trading partnerships stretching from Britain to West Africa, died with the people who held it, and the Mediterranean world that came after was commercially poorer for the loss in ways it could not even measure, because it no longer knew what it was missing. The Phoenician world from which Carthage sprang had been the dominant commercial civilization of the Mediterranean for centuries before Carthage itself rose to prominence, and the shape of that inheritance explains both what Carthage was and how it eventually came to surpass the Levantine cities that had given it birth. The Phoenician city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and their neighbours along the Lebanese coast, had been the great maritime traders of the eastern Mediterranean since the late Bronze Age, operating within the commercial networks that connected Egypt, the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant in a web of exchange that the catastrophic Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BCE disrupted but did not permanently destroy. In the aftermath of that collapse, which had erased or severely weakened nearly every other major power in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously, the Phoenician cities rebuilt their commercial networks with the specific advantage that the collapse had eliminated most of their serious competition. They then expanded those networks westward into the central and western Mediterranean during the centuries between roughly 1100 and 700 BCE, pushed by the hunger for metals that the recovering eastern economies demanded and pulled by the extraordinary riches that the western Mediterranean offered to anyone willing to sail far enough to find them. The Phoenician westward expansion was driven above all by the search for silver, tin, and copper, the metals that Eastern Mediterranean economies required for coinage and for bronze production, and the silver mines of Iberia. In the region the Phoenicians called Tarshish were one of the supreme prizes of the ancient world, accessible only to those with the navigational skill and the commercial relationships to reach them and bring the metal back. The Phoenicians got there first. Their trading posts along the southern coast of Iberia, Gadir, the modern Cadiz, founded around 1100 BCE in the traditional dating and one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe, gave them privileged access to the Iberian silver trade that they exploited for centuries before Greek competition began seriously challenging their Western Mediterranean dominance. Carthage was established within this context of Phoenician westward expansion, positioned almost exactly at the midpoint of the route between the Levantine home cities and the Iberian silver mines, and its geography gave it a natural role that grew over time from relay point to organizing center to outright hegemon of the entire Phoenician western network. As the Levantine home cities came under the mounting pressure of Assyrian and then Babylonian imperial expansion, the Assyrian siege of Tyre in the late 8th century BCE, the Babylonian campaigns that progressively eroded Phoenician political independence throughout the 7th and 6th centuries, Carthage absorbed increasing commercial and political authority over the western colonies that the home cities could no longer effectively supervise or protect. By the 6th century BCE, Carthage was no longer simply a Phoenician colony. It was the dominant power in the Western Phoenician world, exercising the commercial and military authority over the network that Tyre had once provided, collecting the revenues, organizing the defense, and making the strategic decisions that determined where Phoenician power in the Western Mediterranean was directed and how it was deployed. The student had become the master, and the master had been weakened just enough by external pressure to accept the transition without the conflict that might otherwise have accompanied it. The Greeks were the other major power in the Western Mediterranean during the period of Carthaginian rise, and the relationship between Carthage and the Greek world was one of the defining tensions of the ancient Mediterranean across 4 centuries. Greek colonization in the Western Mediterranean had proceeded more or less simultaneously with the Phoenician expansion. Though on different vectors and with different strategic priorities, the Greeks had settled Sicily, southern Italy, southern France, and the eastern coast of Iberia, creating the string of poleis that made the Western Mediterranean a Greek world as much as a Phoenician one. Massalia, the modern Marseille, was a Greek colony. Syracuse in Sicily was a Greek colony. Naples, Neapolis, the new city, was a Greek colony. The Greeks and the Carthaginians competed for commercial dominance across overlapping spheres of interest, and that competition expressed itself both in commercial rivalry and in occasional direct military conflict. The Battle of Alalia in 535 BCE, fought off the coast of Corsica between a combined Carthaginian and Etruscan fleet on one side and a Greek fleet on the other, was among the first major naval engagements in the Western Mediterranean and established something important about the emerging balance of power. The Greeks won the battle technically, inflicting greater losses on the opposing fleet, but lost strategically, withdrawing from their colony at Alalia and ceding effective dominance of Corsica and Sardinia to the Carthaginian sphere. A victory that produces a strategic retreat is a victory in name only. and both sides understood what the outcome at Alalia actually meant for the distribution of Western Mediterranean power. Sicily was the pivot on which Western Mediterranean politics turned for centuries. And understanding why requires understanding the island's particular combination of geography and productivity. Sicily is the largest island in the Mediterranean, positioned at the narrowest point of the sea's central corridor, dividing its eastern and western basins in a way that made it strategically irreplaceable for anyone who wished to control Mediterranean navigation. It was also extraordinarily fertile. The grain of Sicily fed a significant portion of the ancient world, and control of Sicilian agricultural production was a strategic asset of the very first order. The western portion of the island fell within the Carthaginian sphere, organised around the Punic settlements of Panormus, Lilybaeum, and Motia. The eastern portion was Greek territory, organised around the great and magnificently wealthy city of Syracuse. The boundary between these two spheres was contested, renegotiated, and fought over repeatedly throughout the 5th, 4th, and 3rd centuries BCE, in a series of conflicts that consumed enormous resources on both sides without producing a decisive resolution. And it was precisely this unresolved Sicilian contest, this island that neither Carthage nor the Greek world could definitively claim, that eventually drew Rome into the Mediterranean power competition in a way that would change everything, not immediately, and not by anyone's deliberate design, but with the inexorable logic of a situation in which a rising power and an established one share a border that neither fully controls, and in which the ambitions of smaller players create the conditions for a collision that larger ones cannot avoid. What made the Greek-Carthaginian rivalry in Sicily so persistent and so structurally unresolvable was that both sides had too much invested in the island to abandon it, and neither had enough strength to expel the other completely. The Carthaginian cities in the west had been established for generations, their populations rooted in Punic culture and commercially tied to the North African networks that Carthage organised. The Greek cities of the east, Syracuse above all, were wealthy, populous, and defended by the kind of fierce civic pride that Greek polis culture generated with remarkable consistency. Every attempt by one side to push decisively into the other's territory, Carthaginian campaigns of the 5th century that nearly overwhelmed Syracuse, Syracusan counteroffensives that pushed deep into western Sicily, ultimately failed to produce the permanent shift in the balance that the aggressor had sought. The island absorbed each assault and returned to something approximating its previous equilibrium, until Rome arrived. And when Rome arrived, it arrived not as a colonial power with Sicilian ambitions of its own, but as an ally drawn in by the accidents of a local dispute, and then stayed, as Rome always stayed, transforming everything it touched. The political system that governed Carthage was one of the more sophisticated constitutional arrangements in the ancient world, and its specific character, oligarchic in structure, with significant institutional checks on individual power, shaped the way Carthage fought its wars in ways that would eventually prove as consequential as any battlefield decision. The city was governed by a council of elders, a senate in the Roman terminology that our sources apply to it, dominated by the wealthiest commercial families and exercising primary authority over foreign policy, military command, and the revenues of empire. 2 annually elected magistrates called sufetes, the title cognate with the Hebrew shofet, meaning judge, reflecting the common Semitic origin of both the Phoenician and Hebrew political traditions, presided over the council and conducted the city's day-to-day administration in a pair that Roman observers found structurally comparable to their own consular system. Though the sufets carried less executive authority than Roman consuls, and more of the state's real power remained vested in the aristocratic senate behind them, the Council of 104 was a judicial body with oversight powers over military commanders that had no Roman equivalent whatsoever. It could try generals for their conduct of campaigns and execute them if found guilty of treachery or incompetence, a power that created a specific and extensively documented tendency among Carthaginian commanders toward risk aversion, because the punishment for catastrophic failure was not merely political embarrassment or loss of office, but death. The Carthaginian general who lost a battle faced scrutiny from a council that had both the authority and the demonstrated willingness to crucify him afterward. That knowledge lived in every tactical decision a Punic commander made. This oversight mechanism shaped Carthaginian military culture in ways that consistently disadvantaged it relative to Roman strategic practice. And the contrast deserves emphasis because it explains outcomes that pure military analysis cannot fully account for. A Roman general who suffered a catastrophic defeat could, if he survived the battle, continue his career, sometimes distinguished by the very crisis his earlier failure had created. Rome's political culture had no mechanism for punishing a general who had given everything and lost, provided he had not lost through cowardice or treachery. Defeat was a problem to be corrected, not a crime to be punished. The result was a military culture that could absorb disasters of a scale that would have ended most ancient states and keep fighting with something approaching institutional calm. Carthage lost the First Punic War in part because its commanders were too cautious to press advantages and too afraid of their own oversight council to risk the decisive action that the situation repeatedly demanded. Rome kept fighting after Cannae, one of the worst single defeats any army has ever suffered in the entire recorded history of warfare, because its Senate refused to treat the battle as a verdict rather than an event. The asymmetry between these two institutional cultures was not incidental to the outcome of the Punic Wars. It was among the deepest structural reasons Rome won. The military force that Carthage deployed was another direct expression of its commercial character, and it differed from the Roman model in ways that were simultaneously its greatest tactical strength and its most dangerous strategic vulnerability. Carthage did not raise armies from its own citizen population the way Rome did. It hired them. The Carthaginian military was primarily a mercenary force recruited from the diverse peoples of the Western Mediterranean. Libyan and Numidian infantry and cavalry from the North African hinterland, Iberian and Celtiberian heavy infantry from the peninsula, Balearic slingers from the islands whose skill with lead shot was legendary across the ancient world, Gallic warriors from the north whose ferocity in close combat made them valuable shock troops. These diverse contingents were held together by Carthaginian officers, Carthaginian money, and the specific quality of Carthaginian military leadership that the Barcid family would demonstrate in spectacular fashion during the Second Punic War. This mercenary army was in certain respects more versatile and more tactically capable than a citizen levy could have been. It drew on the specific martial skills and fighting traditions of many different peoples, combining the unmatched light cavalry of the Numidians with the heavy infantry discipline of Iberian warriors and the long-range precision of the Balearic slingers in combined arms arrangements of genuine sophistication. But it was fundamentally different in its motivations from a Roman citizen army fighting for its farms and its families and the survival of everything it had ever known. Mercenaries fought for money. When the money stopped flowing, or when the campaign deteriorated to the point where the risks exceeded any plausible reward. Mercenaries had options that citizens defending their homeland simply did not. The navy was the one arm of Carthaginian military power that was distinctly and authentically its own, not mercenary in its crews or its commanders, but Carthaginian in the deepest sense, reflecting the seafaring tradition that the Phoenician heritage had bequeathed to the city across centuries of maritime commerce. The Carthaginian war fleet of the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE was the dominant naval force in the Western Mediterranean, operating the quinquereme, the five-banked galley that served as the battleship of the ancient Mediterranean world, with a skill, experience, and institutional knowledge that no rival could match. Mastery of the sea was so central to Carthaginian strategic thinking, so deeply embedded in the city's understanding of its own power, that when Rome emerged as a serious rival in the 3rd century BCE, the Carthaginian assumption was that Rome could be outmaneuvered and defeated at sea even if it could not be beaten on land. The Romans were a land power. Everyone knew it. The sea was Carthage's domain, had been for generations, and would remain so because seafaring was not something a civilization simply decided to become good at overnight. That assumption was one of the most consequential strategic miscalculations in the entire history of the ancient world. Rome decided to build a navy, built one with terrifying organizational speed, and then used it with the same stubborn institutional determination it applied to every military problem it chose to solve. What Carthage mistook for an inherent limitation in its rival turned out to be merely a temporary gap that Roman organizational intelligence closed faster than anyone had believed possible. The trigger for the First Punic War, when it finally came, was almost absurdly disproportionate to the conflict it produced. The Mamertines, a group of Italian mercenaries who had seized the Sicilian city of Messana at the northeastern tip of the island, called simultaneously on both Rome and Carthage for protection against the Syracusan king Hiero. Both powers responded. Both found themselves unexpectedly facing each other across a local dispute that neither had anticipated managing, and neither fully understood how to exit once it had begun. That is how the greatest naval war of the ancient world started, not with grand strategy or deliberate imperial design, but with a city of hired soldiers playing two Mediterranean powers against each other and accidentally introducing them to the conflict that would define the next century and a half of Western history. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE with a dispute over Sicily that neither Rome nor Carthage had deliberately engineered, and it lasted 23 years, longer than either side had imagined, when the first soldiers crossed the Strait of Messana and the first ambassadors returned home with news that the other power had already moved. 23 years is a long time to sustain a war. Long enough for the children born in its opening year to be fighting in its closing campaigns. Long enough for the original political justifications to have been entirely superseded by the sheer institutional momentum of two large states that had committed too much to consider stopping. But before following the war's specific events, it is worth pausing on what each side was actually fighting with, because the asymmetry between Roman and Carthaginian military cultures was the central dramatic fact of the First Punic War and the source of its most surprising and consequential results. Carthage, in 264 BCE, was the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. Its navy was the finest in the world. Its Sicilian cities, Panormus, Lilybaeum, Drepana, were heavily fortified and well supplied. Its generals had been fighting in Sicilian conditions for generations, on land. Its mercenary army was experienced and competent. At sea, it had no serious rival. Rome, in 264 BCE, had never fought a naval battle of any significance. Its entire military tradition was land-based, built around the Manipular Legion and the vast reserves of Italian allied manpower that had allowed it to field army after army through decades of peninsular warfare. It had a small coastal fleet used primarily for supply and raiding, nothing that could be called a battle fleet by any Mediterranean standard, no experienced admirals, no rowers trained to the demanding standards that galley warfare required. To win this war, Rome was going to have to fight Carthage at sea. What made that seemingly impossible transition achievable was the specific character of Roman institutional organization, the collective intelligence of a senatorial republic that treated military problems as engineering problems, to be solved through the application of sufficient organizational energy and sufficient willingness to absorb the cost of early failures. When the Senate decided Rome needed a navy, the machinery of the Roman state produced one. The famous tradition that Rome built 120 warships in 60 days, copying the design from a Carthaginian quinquereme that had run aground and been captured, reflects this organizational capacity more than any particular genius for shipbuilding. Whether the 60-day figure is precisely accurate or somewhat embellished in the retelling, the core achievement is not in doubt. Rome built a competitive battle fleet from effectively nothing, in a time frame that no prior assessment of Roman naval capability would have predicted. And having built it, Rome then demonstrated the further institutional quality of being willing to learn from early defeats at sea, rather than concluding that naval warfare was simply not something Romans could do. That willingness to fail, to adapt, to try again with modifications, was perhaps the most Roman quality of all. And it was the quality that Carthage with its risk-averse commanders and its punishing oversight council, found most difficult to counter. The tactical innovation that Rome introduced to compensate for its crew's inexperience was the corvus, the raven, a boarding bridge mounted on a rotating pole on the bow of a Roman warship, designed to drop onto the deck of an enemy vessel and lock the two ships together with an iron spike driven through the opposing hull. The corvus converted a naval engagement into something closer to an infantry battle, where Roman soldiers could fight on the terms they understood best, rather than the terms that Carthaginian naval tradition had spent generations perfecting. It was an elegant and characteristically Roman solution to a tactical problem, not trying to match the enemy at his own game, but changing the game entirely so that your own strengths could be applied. The Battle of Mylae, in 260 BCE, the first major engagement of the new Roman fleet, was the first Roman naval victory in Mediterranean history, won largely through the corvus, and its Roman commander, Gaius Duilius, became the first Roman to celebrate a naval triumph. A commemorative column was erected in Rome, decorated with the bronze rams of captured Carthaginian ships, part of which survives today in a later copy in the Capitoline museums, a monument to the moment when a land power announced itself as a sea power, and the entire strategic balance of the Western Mediterranean shifted accordingly. Carthage had not lost a naval engagement of consequence in living memory. The shock of Mylae was not merely military, it was conceptual. The sea was no longer safe in the way it had always been safe, and everything Carthage had assumed about the strategic geography of its empire required urgent reassessment. The war that followed was not decided quickly or cleanly, and the 23 years between its opening and its conclusion were marked as much by catastrophe as by triumph on both sides. The corvus that had won Mylae proved dangerously unstable in heavy weather, and heavy weather in the Mediterranean is not a rare occurrence. Roman fleets were destroyed by storms with a thoroughness that direct battle alone never achieved. The disaster off Cape Palinurus in 253 BCE cost approximately 150 ships to a single storm, and the catastrophe at Camarina in 255 BCE, returning from an expedition to Africa that had briefly threatened Carthage's home territory, destroyed approximately 364 vessels in an afternoon of wind and waves. Losses of this magnitude would have ended most ancient states' capacity or willingness to continue fighting. Rome replaced the ships, recruited new crews, raised new funds through what amounted to a voluntary loan from its wealthiest citizens, and kept fighting, displaying the organizational resilience and absolute refusal to accept a verdict that would become its most consistent strategic characteristic across 4 centuries of subsequent expansion. The war ended in 241 BCE with a Roman naval victory at the Aegates Islands off the western tip of Sicily, destroying the Carthaginian fleet attempting to resupply its Sicilian garrisons and leaving Carthage without the means to continue. The peace terms were harsh. Sicily surrendered. A substantial indemnity agreed. Prisoners released without ransom. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. The Mediterranean world had acquired a new dominant power, and that power was not the one that had entered the war as the favourite. What the First Punic War ultimately revealed was less about the military capabilities of either side than about the institutional characters of the two civilizations that had fought it. Carthage had entered the war with every material advantage: the superior navy, the experienced commanders, the fortified Sicilian bases, the financial resources of a commercial empire. Rome had entered it with none of those advantages, and with the additional burden of having to learn an entirely new form of warfare against an opponent who had been practicing it for generations. That Rome won anyway, that it absorbed losses that would have broken Carthage's will and kept fighting, that it innovated tactically where it could not compete technically, speaks to something deeper than military competence. It speaks to an institutional culture that treated the scale of a problem as a reason to commit more resources rather than a reason to reconsider whether the problem was worth solving. Carthage lost the First Punic War not because it fought badly, but because it was fighting a civilization that had decided, at the deepest institutional level, that losing was not an option it was prepared to accept. The years immediately following the First Punic War nearly destroyed Carthage, not from the outside but from within, and the crisis that erupted in 241 BCE reveals something about the structural vulnerabilities of the Carthaginian system that the war's more dramatic episodes tend to overshadow. The mercenary soldiers who had fought for Carthage in Sicily returned to North Africa expecting payment of the wages owed them. Wages that Carthage, exhausted by 23 years of war and burdened by the indemnity payments Rome had imposed, could not or would not immediately provide. What began as a pay dispute became, with terrifying speed, an existential threat to the city itself. The mercenaries, stranded in North Africa with no easy route home and no money to fund the journey, took up arms. The Libyan population of the Carthaginian hinterland, the Berber farming communities that Carthage had controlled and taxed for generations, and whose tax burden had been made considerably more onerous by the demands of the war and its aftermath, joined the revolt with the accumulated grievances of people who had been extracted from without receiving sufficient security or benefit in return. The Libyan towns that opened their gates to the mercenary army were not merely making an opportunistic military calculation, they were making a statement, long deferred, about their relationship to a Carthaginian colonial system they had endured rather than chosen. Within months, Carthage found itself besieged by the army it had created, fighting for its survival against the very soldiers whose skill had sustained its empire, in a conflict that ancient sources described with a specificity of horror, suggesting that what happened in those years exceeded the ordinary violence of ancient warfare by a considerable margin. The conflict that historians call the Mercenary War, and that the ancient sources more honestly called the Truceless War, the Bellum Inexpiabile, the War Without Mercy, lasted nearly 4 years and produced some of the most extreme violence in the ancient world's long and well-documented catalogue of atrocities. Both sides executed their prisoners with a systematic brutality, calibrated not merely to eliminate enemies, but to communicate the costs of continued resistance to everyone who was watching. The mercenary forces crucified Carthaginian commanders they captured. Carthage responded in kind, and then exceeded it, in an escalating cycle of retribution that stripped the conflict of any possibility of negotiated resolution and left both sides committed to the mutual annihilation that the war's other name described. The city came genuinely close to destruction. Its North African territories were in open revolt. Its financial resources, already depleted by the war with Rome and the indemnity, were being consumed by a domestic military emergency of the most acute kind, the mercenary generals, Matho and Spendius, a Libyan and a runaway Roman slave whose names the sources preserve with the specificity of people who had caused serious trouble, proved capable military commanders who understood how to maintain coalition discipline among a force of many different nationalities, united primarily by the shared grievance of unpaid service and the shared danger of having nowhere else to go. The man who saved Carthage from this internal catastrophe was Hamilcar Barca, and his name and his family's subsequent career are the key to understanding everything that follows in the Punic story. Hamilcar was a military commander of exceptional ability, whose campaigns in Sicily during the First Punic War had been more consistently successful than those of most of his contemporaries, fighting a difficult defensive campaign in the western part of the island with limited resources and producing results that the broader Carthaginian failure at sea consistently overshadowed. His suppression of the mercenary war displayed the same combination of tactical intelligence, personal courage, psychological acuity, and ruthless determination that his more famous son would later demonstrate on an incomparably larger stage. He divided the mercenary coalition by exploiting the differences between its national components, playing the various contingents against each other, negotiating separately with Libyan towns that offered to surrender early, using conspicuous clemency toward those who submitted and extreme violence against those who continued to resist in ways precisely calculated to make the cost of continued resistance visible and credible to those still deciding. The final battle, fought in a confined valley where Hamilcar trapped the mercenary remnant, was less a military engagement than a systematic elimination, and Hamilcar allowed it to be as complete as it was because he understood what a mercenary war that ended in compromise would teach every future mercenary force that Carthage employed. It needed to end in total defeat and the complete restoration of Carthaginian authority. Anything less would be an invitation to repetition. With Carthage stabilized and his own reputation substantially elevated by the suppression of the revolt, Hamilcar turned his attention westward to the project that would transform the Barcid family from a distinguished Carthaginian military dynasty into the most consequential force in Mediterranean history: the conquest and development of Iberia. The Iberian campaign that Hamilcar launched in 237 BCE was not embraced with uniform enthusiasm by the Carthaginian Senate, where the Hanno faction, representing more cautious agricultural and commercial interests, preferred consolidating the North African territories to pursuing expensive overseas military adventures of uncertain return. Hamilcar went anyway, taking with him his sons, including the 9-year-old Hannibal, who, according to the most famous story in all of Barcid legend, begged to accompany his father and was told he could come only if he swore eternal enmity to Rome. Hannibal swore. He kept the oath with a fidelity that would reshape the ancient world. What the Barcids built in Iberia over the following 2 decades, under Hamilcar until his death by drowning in 228 BCE, then under his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair until his assassination in 221 BCE, and finally under Hannibal himself from the age of 25, was something Carthage had never quite possessed before: a territorial empire with loyal subject populations, systematic revenue from the silver mines of the south and east, and a professional army seasoned through years of continuous campaigning that owed its primary loyalty not to the distant Senate in Carthage, but to the Barcid commanders who had trained it, led it, and paid it from the wealth that Iberian silver provided. The capital the Barcids established at Carthago Nova, the modern Cartagena. Positioned on a promontory with harbour access and the richest silver mines in Iberia directly adjacent, was a city on the Carthaginian model, a physical statement of Barcid ambition and organisational intelligence. From Carthago Nova, Hannibal would eventually launch the operation that brought him across the Alps and to the gates of Rome itself. But that is still a chapter ahead. What matters at this moment in the story is what the Iberian decade and a half had produced: an army of extraordinary quality, a revenue base of enormous depth, a commander of transcendent ability, and a plan for using all three that had been forming in Hannibal's mind since the day he swore his oath beside his father on the shore of a sea they both intended to cross. Hannibal Barca is one of the greatest military commanders in human history, and that assessment does not come from admirers or from the romantic tradition that has built up around his name across 22 centuries. It comes from the Romans, who had every conceivable reason to minimize his abilities and who still could not bring themselves to deny them. His name means grace of Baal in Phoenician, Hannibal, the favour of the supreme deity, and he had been raised in the Barcid military tradition since the age of 9, accompanying his father's campaigns in Iberia, serving as an officer through the remainder of the Iberian pacification under his father's successors, absorbing the art of command, the way that children raised in that environment absorb it, not from manuals but from proximity to genius under pressure. By the time he took command of the Iberian army at 25, following the assassination of his brother-in-law Hasdrubal, he was a man of comprehensive military education, deep personal charisma that inspired loyalty across the many different nationalities of his polyglot army, and a strategic understanding of the Roman-Carthaginian conflict that went beyond anything his contemporaries on either side possessed. The specific event that triggered the Second Punic War was the siege of Saguntum, a city on the eastern coast of Iberia with a treaty relationship with Rome, which Hannibal besieged and captured in 219 BCE, knowing perfectly well what Rome's response would be. Rome demanded his surrender. Carthage refused, the war that Hannibal had been preparing for years. and that he intended to fight on his own terms in his own chosen theatre, finally had its formal beginning. Hannibal's strategic analysis of the Roman-Carthaginian situation was approximately as follows, and it is worth spelling out in some detail because it was a genuinely original piece of strategic thinking that no one on either side had previously articulated with comparable clarity. Carthage could not beat Rome by fighting a defensive war in Africa or in Sicily. The sea approach to Italy was now commanded by Rome, which had built and demonstrated a competitive navy during the First Punic War. The direct sea crossing to the Italian peninsula was therefore unavailable without fighting a naval battle under unfavourable conditions. But Rome's strategic position contained a vulnerability that a sufficiently bold land campaign could exploit. Rome's power depended fundamentally on the loyalty of its Italian allies, the peoples of the peninsula who provided the manpower that Roman armies required, and without whom Rome could not sustain the scale of military effort that its strategic position demanded. If Rome could be beaten decisively enough, beaten not once but repeatedly, beaten in battles so catastrophically destructive that the confidence of the Italian allies in Roman protection was genuinely shattered, those allies might defect. An Italy in which Rome's allies had abandoned it was an Italy in which Roman manpower was reduced by more than half, in which the logistical support for Roman armies evaporated, and in which the political foundation of Roman dominance of the peninsula was undermined at its base. Hannibal did not intend to capture Rome by siege. He intended to dissolve the Roman alliance system by fighting Rome to the point of political collapse. The distinction between those two objectives was the difference between a plan that was impossible and a plan that came terrifyingly close to working. The route to Italy that Hannibal chose was the land route west along the coast of Iberia, across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, and then across the Alps in the late autumn of 218 BCE, a crossing that has been one of the enduring images of the ancient world for 2,000 years and that deserves every element of the reputation it carries. Ancient sources place his army at the start of the crossing at approximately 38,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry, plus the war elephants that were simultaneously the most visually dramatic and the least practically significant element of his force. The Alps in late autumn are not a gentle obstacle. The passes were covered in snow and ice. The paths were narrow enough in places that a single man stumbling could initiate a chain of falling soldiers and animals that cleared the trail more efficiently than any enemy. Alpine tribes attacked the column from the heights, rolling boulders onto the packed files below, picking off stragglers. Striking at night when the army was most vulnerable, the crossing took 15 days and produced casualties on a scale that left Hannibal descending into the Po Valley with perhaps 25,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. He had lost approximately a third of his force in the mountains before fighting a single pitched battle in Italy. What he had gained in exchange was something that no calculation of losses and gains entirely captures. The psychological effect of an army materializing in northern Italy from a direction the Romans had not prepared for and had not fully believed possible was itself a weapon, and Hannibal understood how to use it. The Italian campaign that followed produced 3 of the greatest Roman defeats in the Republic's history in less than 2 years. And the speed and completeness of those defeats still has the quality of something almost impossible when read against the background of Roman military power. The Battle of the Trebia, in December of 218 BCE, where Hannibal destroyed a Roman army by luring it across a freezing river in the early morning, numbing the Roman infantry before they reached his lines and then unleashing his Numidian cavalry to envelop the flanks. The Battle of Lake Trasimene in June of 217 BCE, the largest ambush in military history, where Hannibal concealed his entire army in the hills above the lake shore and destroyed a Roman force of approximately 30,000 men in an engagement so compressed and so violent that soldiers fighting in its centre reportedly did not notice an earthquake that occurred during the battle itself. And then Cannae. In August of 216 BCE, the battle that military academies still study, that Scipio studied, that every serious student of warfare has studied since, where Hannibal, with an army numerically smaller than the Roman force facing him, produced the most complete tactical encirclement in ancient history. killing approximately 50,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon. After Cannae, virtually every Roman ally in southern Italy defected. Capua, the second city of Italy, went over to Hannibal. The kingdom of Macedon entered alliance against Rome. Hannibal's strategy was working with a precision that exceeded even his own ambitious projections. What Cannae felt like from inside the Roman formation is something the sources gesture toward without fully capturing. The gradual realization, as the Carthaginian centre gave ground deliberately and the wings curved inward, that the army was no longer fighting a battle but being swallowed by one. The Roman soldiers in the centre were pressed so tightly together by the encircling movement that men died not from wounds but from suffocation, unable to raise their arms to defend themselves in the crush of bodies. It was not merely a defeat. It was an annihilation conducted with surgical precision by a commander who had designed every element of the trap weeks in advance and sprung it at exactly the moment his opponent's momentum made escape impossible. The news that reached Rome in the days following was met with a silence that the sources describe as more frightening than weeping. The silence of a city that had not yet found the language for what had happened to it, and that would need to find that language very quickly. Because Hannibal was still in Italy, and the war was not over. The question that has occupied historians and military theorists for more than 2,000 years, why, after Cannae, did Hannibal not march on Rome, is one that the available evidence will probably never resolve with the certainty that the question seems to demand. The Hannibal story, in which Hannibal's Numidian cavalry commander tells him after the battle that he knows how to win a victory, but not how to finish one, and that in 4 days Hannibal could be dining on the capital, is almost certainly a later invention of the tradition rather than a historical exchange. But it captures the genuine puzzle with enough precision that it has survived 2 millennia of retelling, because the puzzle is real, even if the anecdote is not. The city of Rome in August of 216 BCE was effectively undefended. The armies that might have stopped a Carthaginian advance had been destroyed. The psychological shock of Cannae was deep and visible. The sources describe a city in which women gathered in the streets, in which the Senate struggled to maintain the public composure that Roman political culture demanded, in which the scale of the loss had temporarily overwhelmed the institutional machinery of response. A march on Rome in the weeks immediately following Cannae might have been decisive. The most compelling answer to why Hannibal did not attempt it is that his strategic plan had never required the capture of Rome in the first place. He did not have siege equipment sufficient for a city of Rome's size and fortification. He did not have the manpower to sustain a siege that might last months against a population fighting for its survival. His strategy was to isolate Rome from its allies, and at the moment he chose not to march. That strategy appeared to be succeeding beyond any previous expectation. Rome's response to Cannae was the thing that Hannibal had not been able to fully factor into his strategic calculations, because it was genuinely without precedent in the ancient world. When the Senate convened in the days after the battle, with the casualty reports still arriving and the panic of surviving citizens palpable in the streets of the city, it did not negotiate. It did not send envoys to Hannibal to discuss terms. It refused, with a coldness that shocked even some Romans, to ransom the approximately 8,000 prisoners who had survived the battle, a refusal that condemned those men to slavery or death, but communicated to every Italian ally that was watching that Rome would not acknowledge defeat regardless of its scale. New legions were enrolled from freed men and criminals. The Senate refused to receive Hannibal's peace delegation and appointed the cautious and methodical Fabius Maximus Verrucosus as dictator with a specific mandate, not to fight Hannibal in the open battles where Hannibal excelled, but to shadow his army through southern Italy without engaging it directly, to cut off foraging parties, to attack isolated detachments, to deny Hannibal the decisive engagement he needed to complete the destruction of Roman power. The Romans called this the strategy of the cunctator. The delayer. Hannibal's soldiers had their own name for Fabius, less respectful and more accurate about what the strategy was actually doing to Carthaginian prospects in Italy. It was working, slowly, grinding, without the dramatic satisfaction of a pitched battle. It was working, The 15 years that the war in Italy lasted after Cannae had a specific texture that the dramatic peaks of the campaign, Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae, and eventually Zama, tend to compress into something cleaner and more legible than the reality was. Hannibal's army in Italy for those 15 years was a force sustained entirely by what it could extract from the Italian countryside and from the territories of the allies who had joined him. Without a secure supply line from Carthage, and without the permanent base of operations that any conventional military doctrine of any period would have considered the minimum precondition for a sustained offensive campaign. The Carthaginian Senate's failure to reinforce him adequately is one of the most contested questions in the historiography of the Second Punic War. Hannibal repeatedly requested reinforcements and supplies that the Senate in Carthage either could not or chose not to provide in sufficient quantity. His brother Hasdrubal marched from Iberia with a relief force in 207 BCE, crossing the Alps as Hannibal had done and descending into northern Italy, and was destroyed at the Battle of the Metaurus River before Hannibal could march north to join him. The Roman consuls Gaius, Claudius Nero, and Marcus Livius Salinator caught Hasdrubal's army and annihilated it in an engagement whose outcome Hannibal learned when his brother's severed head was thrown into his camp by Roman soldiers who understood exactly what they were communicating. Hannibal looked at it and understood what it meant. The relief he had been waiting for was gone. The war in Italy was effectively over, even if the formal ending was still years away. The communities of southern Italy that had defected to Hannibal after Cannae paid a price for their choice that the sources record only partially, but that the archaeology of the region illuminates with growing specificity. Capua, the great Campanian city whose defection had represented the single most dramatic crack in the Italian alliance system, was besieged and reconquered by Rome in 211 BCE, and the punishment Rome inflicted was exemplary in the most Roman and most terrible sense of that word. Its leading citizens were executed, its senate was abolished, its land was confiscated, and its political independence was permanently extinguished. Capua became a ward of Rome, governed by a prefect, stripped of everything that had made it the second city of Italy. The message to every other community watching, stay with Rome, or receive what Capua received, was received and understood with a clarity that no diplomatic communication could have matched. The Samnites, the Lucanians, the Bruttians, the peoples of the Italian south who had the longest histories of resistance to Roman dominance and who had therefore been most willing to see in Hannibal's arrival an opportunity for something resembling liberation. These peoples paid the heaviest price of all when Rome won. Their territories were absorbed. Their autonomy was reduced. Their populations were thinned by war and the famine and disease that followed armies through the ancient world. And the political settlements Rome imposed on the south in the war's aftermath left marks on the region that persisted for generations. What those 15 years in Italy meant from Hannibal's own perspective. What it felt like to maintain an army in a foreign country without adequate support. To win battle after battle without winning the war. To watch the strategy that had worked so brilliantly at Cannae gradually lose its force as Rome refused to behave the way a defeated civilization was supposed to behave, is something the sources do not preserve in any form that allows genuine access to his inner life. What they do preserve is the image of a commander who maintained his army's discipline and cohesion through 15 years of increasingly difficult circumstances, who never lost a pitched battle on Italian soil despite those circumstances, and who eventually received the order to return to Africa with an army that had fought dozens of engagements from the Alps to Calabria and had won almost all of them. They boarded ships at Croton on the Bruttian coast and sailed for Africa. What they felt about leaving, about the country where so many companions had died and where so much had been achieved to no final purpose. The sources, characteristically, do not say. Publius Cornelius Scipio was 25 years old when the Popular Assembly of Rome elected him to command the Iberian campaign, and the circumstances of his election tell you almost as much about the state of the war at that moment as any military account could. The conventional Roman system for assigning military commands required candidates to have served the full sequence of offices, the cursus honorum, before receiving a major appointment of that kind. Scipio had not. He was young, relatively inexperienced at the level of independent command, and he was being sent to a theatre that had consumed 2 Roman armies and 2 senior commanders in the previous decade, his own father and uncle among them, killed, fighting the Barcids in Iberia in 211 BCE. The popular assembly bypassed the conventions because there were no senior commanders available who wanted the Iberian assignment. It had the reputation of a posting from which generals did not return with their reputations intact, and the senators who might otherwise have claimed the command had sufficient political instinct to recognize a poisoned opportunity when it was offered to them. What they did not recognize, and could not have known, was that they were handing the most consequential Roman military command of the age to the one man in the Republic who possessed both the tactical genius to dismantle the Barcid Empire in Iberia and the strategic vision to understand that, dismantling it, there was only the necessary preparation for the operation that would actually end the war, the invasion of Africa itself, striking at Carthage on its home ground and forcing Hannibal to abandon Italy to defend the city he had left behind. The Iberian campaign of 210 to 206 BCE displayed, in concentrated form, the military qualities that would define Scipio's career and make him the only Roman commander of the age that serious military analysts would place in the same conversation as Hannibal himself. The capture of Carthago Nova in 209 BCE was its opening statement, an assault conducted simultaneously from the sea, from the landward walls, and through the lagoon that Scipio's scouts had identified as passable at low tide, hitting the city's defences at multiple points simultaneously and overwhelming the garrison's capacity to respond to any single threat before another materialized. The operation displayed the characteristic Scipionic approach to military problems, comprehensive intelligence gathering before the assault, multiple, simultaneous axes of attack that denied the defender the ability to concentrate, and personal leadership at the point of greatest danger that communicated to his soldiers that their commander was not directing the battle from a position of safety, but sharing its risks with them. Carthago Nova fell in a single day. Its silver reserves, its warehouses of military equipment, its harbour facilities, the entire material foundation of the Barcid Empire in Iberia, passed into Roman hands in one afternoon, and the strategic momentum of the Iberian campaign shifted in a way it never recovered from. The Battle of Ilipa in 206 BCE, where Scipio defeated a substantially larger Carthaginian army in the final major engagement of the Iberian campaign, was a demonstration that he had not merely learned from Hannibal's tactical innovations, but had developed genuine refinements of his own. Scipio reversed the standard Roman deployment, placing his best Roman troops on the flanks rather than in the centre, which he filled with Spanish allied infantry of lesser quality, and then executing a complex lateral manoeuvre during the battle itself that changed the character of the engagement in mid-fight, catching the Carthaginian commanders at the moment when their formation was most committed and least able to respond. It was the kind of tactical creativity that required not only the initial design, but the ability to communicate complex instructions to multiple subordinate commanders and trust them to execute simultaneously under the stress of battle. That combination of conceptual originality and organizational execution was the signature of Scipio's military genius, and Ilipa demonstrated it as completely as any engagement in his career. With Iberia secured, the Barcid Empire there dismantled, and his own reputation transformed from a promising young commander into the most admired general in the Roman world, Scipio turned to the political battle that in some respects was harder than any campaign he had fought, convincing the Roman Senate to authorize the invasion of Africa. The opposition came primarily from the Fabian faction, the conservative senatorial group that had supported the cautious strategy of avoiding decisive engagement with Hannibal in Italy, and that was instinctively suspicious of commanders whose personal military reputations exceeded what the collective senatorial system was comfortable granting to any individual. Fabius himself argued that Hannibal should be forced out of Italy rather than drawn out of it, that an African campaign risked leaving the peninsula exposed while Hannibal remained there, and that the proper Roman approach was methodical attrition rather than dramatic strategic gambles. The argument had enough surface plausibility to generate serious opposition, but the political momentum behind the African campaign was ultimately irresistible, and Scipio received his command. He was 31 years old. He landed in Africa in 204 BCE, established a base near Utica, and began the series of operations that would culminate in the battle that ended the Second Punic War and determined, for the following 6 centuries, which civilization would organize the Mediterranean world. When the military situation in Africa deteriorated sufficiently, Carthage recalled Hannibal from Italy, ending 15 years of Italian campaigning without the decisive victory that the strategy had required, and setting up the confrontation at Zama in 202 BCE between the 2 greatest commanders of the age, each leading the finest army his civilization could assemble, each understanding exactly what was at stake. The Battle of Zama was in its structural logic the mirror image of Cannae, and the symmetry was not accidental. Scipio had studied Cannae with the specific intention of understanding how to reverse its outcome when he faced Hannibal directly. Where Hannibal at Cannae had used a weak centre to draw the Roman infantry forward, while his superior cavalry drove off the Roman horse, and his flanks curved inward to encircle, Scipio at Zama trained his soldiers to open lanes in their formation for Hannibal's 80 war elephants to pass through harmlessly, neutralizing the weapon that Hannibal was deploying in greater numbers than any previous engagement. The Numidian cavalry of Massinissa, the North African prince who had transferred his allegiance to Rome, drove Hannibal's cavalry from the field. The Roman and allied cavalry returned from their pursuit to strike Hannibal's veteran third line from behind, at precisely the moment when the infantry engagement in front was fully committed. Hannibal, for the first and only time in his military career, was enveloped. The man who had made encirclement his signature achievement found it executed against him by a commander who had learned the lesson from the original. The Second Punic War was over. Rome had won, and the shape of the world for the next 6 centuries was settled on an African plain on a day in 202 BCE that neither civilization would ever fully recover from. The peace terms that Rome imposed on Carthage after Zama were designed to be permanently disabling, and on paper they succeeded. Carthage surrendered its war elephants and its entire war fleet. It agreed to pay an indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver spread across 50 annual installments, a sum so enormous that the Roman Senate, in setting the figure, was almost certainly expecting it to function as a permanent financial constraint that would prevent Carthaginian recovery for at least a generation. Possibly 2. Carthage was prohibited from conducting any military operations outside Africa without explicit Roman permission, effectively reducing the city from a Mediterranean imperial power to a supervised regional entity that could neither project force nor defend its own interests, without first obtaining the approval of the civilization that had just defeated it. Hannibal himself remained in Carthage in the years immediately following the peace, serving as suffect and applying to the city's finances the same analytical intelligence he had applied to his military campaigns, restructuring the tax collection system, pursuing the corrupt officials who had been diverting public revenues, and making the indemnity payments manageable through governmental reform rather than additional extraction from an already exhausted population. He was, by the accounts available to us, remarkably effective, too effective. His domestic reforms made enemies of the powerful families whose financial arrangements he had disturbed, and those enemies did what Carthaginian political culture made available to them. They accused him to Rome of conducting secret correspondence with Rome's enemies. Faced with extradition, Hannibal fled into exile, moving from court to court across the eastern Mediterranean for the remainder of his life until, with Roman pressure closing around him at the court of King Prusias of Bithynia in 183 BCE, he took the poison he had carried in a ring throughout his years of wandering. The greatest commander of the age died alone in a foreign country, hunted to his end by the civilization he had come so close to destroying. What happened to Carthage in the 50 years between Zama and the outbreak of the Third Punic War is one of the more remarkable stories in the entire history of the ancient Mediterranean, and it tends to be compressed or overlooked entirely in accounts dominated by the dramatic arcs of the Hannibal campaign and the final destruction of the city. In those 50 years, Carthage demonstrated something that its Roman observers found genuinely unsettling: the capacity to recover from catastrophic military defeat and crushing financial obligation with a speed and effectiveness that the peace terms had been specifically designed to prevent. The indemnity of 10,000 talents, which the Senate had expected to occupy Carthaginian financial resources for 50 years, was paid off in approximately 10 years. 10 years. Not 50. The Carthaginian commercial community achieved this through exactly the organizational intelligence and financial sophistication that had built the original empire. Restructuring trade networks, intensifying agricultural production in the North African hinterland, applying the commercial efficiency that was the deepest and most durable expression of the Punic character. The harbour was maintained, the merchant fleet was rebuilt, the commercial relationships that the war had disrupted were carefully re-established across the western Mediterranean, and by the 1760s and 1750s BCE, Carthage was once again generating the kind of commercial prosperity that had made it the dominant economic power of the western Mediterranean before the wars began. The Roman senators who visited Carthage in 153 BCE as part of a diplomatic delegation, among them Marcus Porcius Cato, the most morally insistent and politically influential figure in the Roman Republic of his generation, came home alarmed by what they had seen. Cato's alarm was not irrational in its economic foundations, whatever one concludes about the political and moral conclusions he drew from it. A Carthage that had paid off 10,000 talents ahead of schedule and continued to prosper was a Carthage that retained the commercial infrastructure, the merchants, the navigators, the agricultural managers, the financial specialists, the harbour facilities that had made it the dominant commercial power of the Western Mediterranean for 2 centuries. Its military power was gone. Its political autonomy was severely constrained by the peace terms, but its commercial genius was intact, functioning, and visibly generating the wealth that military power eventually required. To Cato's Roman mind, shaped by a political culture that understood the relationship between commercial prosperity and military capacity better than almost any other in the ancient world, a commercially vigorous Carthage was a Carthage that could, given sufficient time, afford to challenge Rome again. His response to that perception became one of the most famous rhetorical campaigns in the history of the Roman Senate, reportedly ending every speech, regardless of its subject, with the same sentence, Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendam. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. The political mechanism through which the destruction was eventually engineered involved the Numidian king Massinissa, Rome's most important North African ally and one of the most consequential opportunists in the ancient world. Massinissa had fought alongside Scipio at Zama, and in the decades following the peace, he systematically exploited his Roman alliance to encroach on Carthaginian territory, seizing agricultural land, raiding border communities, absorbing Carthaginian settlements into his expanding Numidian kingdom, all while Rome, treaty-bound to adjudicate such disputes, consistently ruled in Massinissa's favour or simply declined to rule at all. By 150 BCE, Massinissa's encroachments had become so frequent and so damaging that Carthage, unable to defend itself militarily without Roman permission and unable to obtain justice through Roman arbitration, raised an army to stop the raids by force. It was exactly the treaty violation that Rome had been waiting for. The pretext was genuine in its technical legal character and completely manufactured in its political significance. Carthage had been provoked into a defensive response and then penalized for defending itself by the same power that had encouraged the provocation. The Senate declared war in 149 BCE. Cato died in 149 BCE, the year the Third Punic War began. Having lived long enough to see the war he had argued for across years of senatorial repetition finally commence, but not long enough to see it end. His political opponent, Scipio Nasica, had argued the opposite case, that Carthage's continued existence provided Rome with the external pressure that kept Roman civic virtue sharp and Roman political culture disciplined, and that the removal of that external threat would accelerate the internal decay that imperial prosperity was already encouraging. Nasica was probably correct in his analysis and entirely ineffective in his advocacy. History does not always reward the person who sees most clearly. Cato's blunter argument prevailed. The war he demanded was declared, and the city he had spent years insisting must be destroyed was about to discover what Roman insistence, backed by Roman legions, actually meant in practice. The Roman demand delivered to Carthage in 149 BCE. After the Senate had declared war, and before a single Roman soldier had landed on African soil, was one of the most deliberately cruel diplomatic communications in the ancient world's long history of diplomatic cruelty. The initial demands were presented in stages, each stage designed to extract compliance before revealing the next requirement, in a negotiating strategy that used the appearance of reasonableness to draw Carthage deeper into a position from which no exit remained. First, Rome demanded hostages, 300 children of the leading Carthaginian families, delivered to Roman custody as security for Carthage's compliance with whatever followed. Carthage, desperate to avoid war, complied. The children were taken. Then Rome demanded the surrender of all weapons and military equipment in the city. Swords, spears, catapults, the entire material of Carthaginian military capacity. Carthage, still hoping that compliance would purchase peace, complied again. 200,000 sets of arms and 2,000 catapults were surrendered to the Roman commissioners who had arrived to receive them. Only then, with the hostages taken and the weapons gone, did the Roman commissioners deliver the final demand: Carthage must be abandoned. The entire population must relocate at least 10 miles inland from the sea, effectively destroying the commercial city and its harbour that were the entire basis of Carthaginian life and identity. The population could survive, but the city, the harbour, the Cothon, the warehouses, the temples, the bursa, everything that Carthage actually was, must be levelled. Rome would do the levelling, or Carthage could do it themselves. Either way, the city on the promontory of the Bay of Tunis was going to cease to exist. The response of the Carthaginian population to this demand was not the submission that the sequential extraction of hostages and weapons had been designed to produce. It was rage, a rage so complete and so unanimous that the ancient sources describing it have the quality of eyewitness testimony even where they are not. The Carthaginian Senate, which had counselled compliance at each previous stage, found itself overridden by a popular fury that the final demand had ignited beyond any institutional capacity to contain or redirect. The Roman commissioners were expelled, the city gates were shut, and Carthage, stripped of its weapons and its children and its last diplomatic options, began the most extraordinary act of collective improvisation in the ancient world's long history of siege warfare. The streets of the city were converted into weapons workshops operating continuously, day and night, with the entire population participating in the production of the armaments that Rome had taken from them. Women cut their hair to provide the fibre for bowstrings. The specific detail that the ancient sources preserve with a consistency suggesting it was genuinely remembered as the symbol of what the city had been willing to give. And the temples and public buildings not essential to the defence were stripped of their materials for fortification and weapon production. Ancient sources record that the city was manufacturing 140 shields, 300 swords, 500 spears, and 1,000 projectiles for catapults every single day at the height of the preparation. A disarmed city was rearming itself through sheer collective will, and the Romans who arrived expecting to supervise a surrender found themselves facing a siege. The siege of Carthage lasted 3 years, from 149 to 146 BCE, and the resistance the city mounted across those 3 years was one of the most extraordinary episodes in the ancient world's catalogue of human endurance under impossible conditions. The Romans, who had expected a relatively rapid conclusion against a population that had already surrendered its weapons and whose children were in Roman custody, found themselves confronting defenders who fought for every approach, every wall, every street, with the specific ferocity of people who had been told there was no acceptable outcome to their surrender, and had therefore decided that the cost of taking the city must be made as high as possible. 2 Roman commanders failed to make decisive progress against the defences before the Senate turned to Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, 37 years old, elected consul specifically for this command, in a procedure that bypassed the conventional age requirements, just as his grandfather's African command had bypassed them a generation earlier. Scipio Aemilianus tightened the siege with a systematic thoroughness that progressively strangled the city's supply lines, cutting off the harbour access that Carthage had partially restored during the siege by digging a new channel to the sea, and reducing the population through starvation and disease in the grinding. Merciless arithmetic of ancient siege warfare before the final assault began, when the Romans breached the final defences and entered the city in 146 BCE. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was the methodical destruction of a living urban world, conducted street by street, building by building, floor by floor. In the urban combat that the ancient sources describe with a specificity suggesting direct experience, soldiers clearing each level of multi-story buildings, throwing the defenders and sometimes the already dead from the upper floors onto the streets below to clear the way for the advance upward. The burning of Carthage took 17 days. Scipio Aemilianus watched from outside the walls, and his friend, the historian Polybius, who was present, recorded that Scipio wept, not from sentiment about Carthage, not from regret about what he was doing, but, by his own account, as Polybius preserved it, from the recognition that what was happening to Carthage might someday happen to Rome. He quoted Homer. He contemplated the transience of empires. He reflected, in the smoke and the heat of a city burning for the second week, on the particular fragility of civilizations that believe themselves permanent. Then he ordered the ruins ploughed under and the site formally cursed. With construction prohibited for a generation, the approximately 50,000 people who had survived 3 years of siege were sold into slavery. The territory became the Roman province of Africa, the Tophet, whose thousands of votive stelae had recorded the names of Carthaginian worshippers for centuries, was buried under the rubble of the city that the rubble had once supported. Carthage as a Punic city, as a living expression of the Phoenician commercial civilization that had shaped the Western Mediterranean for 6 centuries, ceased to exist on a specific afternoon in 146 BCE. The fire that consumed it was still burning when the legions began their methodical work of ensuring that nothing remained to burn again. What was lost when Carthage burned is a question that haunts the historiography of the ancient Mediterranean, with a persistence that no other destroyed civilization quite matches, because the loss was so comprehensive and so deliberate that its full dimensions cannot even be measured. We do not know what was in the libraries of Carthage when the Romans burned them. We will never know. What we can say with confidence is that a civilization literate for centuries, that had administered a commercial empire of enormous complexity across the entire Western Mediterranean, that had produced the agricultural science sophisticated enough that Rome preserved it even while destroying everything else, that had generated the navigational tradition that sent ships to sub-Saharan Africa and the North Atlantic, that civilization was producing written records, histories, religious texts, philosophical works, literary productions of kinds that the accident of destruction has made permanently invisible to us. We have the Carthaginian agricultural treatises, partially, Through the Latin translation the Roman Senate commissioned, we have Carthaginian coins, architectural remains, votive inscriptions. The material culture that archaeology has patiently recovered from beneath the Roman city built on Punic foundations. We have traces of the Punic language in transcribed texts quoted by later authors, and in the communities of North Africa where the language persisted as a living tongue for centuries after the city's destruction. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries of the Common Era, mentions Punic as a living language in the rural areas around his diocese, which means the language of Hannibal was still being spoken 500 years after the destruction of Carthage, carried forward in the mouths of farmers and villagers who had never seen the city their ancestors had built and lost. The problem of sources for Carthaginian history is not merely an academic inconvenience to be noted and moved past. It is a fundamental epistemological challenge that shapes every single claim we can make about the civilization, and it deserves direct engagement rather than the footnote treatment it receives in most popular accounts. We have no Carthaginian histories. We have no Carthaginian philosophy. We have no Carthaginian literature in any form that has survived independently of quotation in hostile sources. The primary narrative source for the Punic Wars is Polybius, a Greek historian taken to Rome as a political hostage after the Third Macedonian War in 167 BCE, who became the intimate companion of Scipio Africanus, the man who destroyed Carthage, and who was standing beside Scipio when Scipio wept at the burning. Polybius tried to be fair. He admired Hannibal genuinely and described him with a specificity, suggesting access to sources closer to the Carthaginian side than most writers of the Roman era possessed. But he was working within a framework of values and assumptions that Rome had shaped, writing for an audience that had won the wars he was describing, and the specific silences and emphases of his account reflect this position in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes impossible to detect. Livy, whose history of Rome is the other major narrative source for the Punic Wars, wrote more than 2 centuries after the events he described, during the reign of Augustus, and his Hannibal is a figure of terrifying military genius combined with the bad faith and cruelty that the Roman tradition attributed to the Punic character as a defining and hereditary characteristic. The phrase Punica fides, Punic faith, had become in the Latin tradition a synonym for treachery, so settled that Roman orators could invoke it without explanation, confident that every listener understood the reference. That is what comprehensive victory over an enemy's reputation looks like when it is fully achieved. The modern reassessment of Carthage began primarily with archaeology, with the excavation of the site that revealed beneath the Roman city a Punic civilization of genuine sophistication that the literary tradition had systematically obscured. The archaeological Carthage that emerged from a century of patient excavation was not the barbaric child-burning enemy of Roman propaganda, but a city of rational urban planning, sophisticated harbour engineering, productive agricultural science, and a religious tradition that was, whatever one concludes about the Tophet controversy, far more nuanced than the ancient accounts suggested. The Tophet itself remains one of the most contested sites in Mediterranean archaeology. The scholarly argument between those who interpret the urns of cremated children as evidence of genuine sacrificial practice and those who argue for a cemetery of naturally deceased infants still unresolved despite decades of forensic analysis and increasingly sophisticated osteological examination of the remains. What is certain is that the Tophet's portrayal in ancient sources served as the primary rhetorical instrument through which Rome justified the destruction of Carthage to audiences that might otherwise have questioned whether the elimination of an entire civilization was a proportionate response to commercial rivalry and military competition, whether the sacrifice was real, exaggerated, or fabricated. The accusation performed its political function with complete effectiveness. Carthage was presented as a civilization that burned its children, and the presentation made the civilization's destruction easier to frame as righteousness rather than what it actually was. The deliberate elimination of a rival whose commercial genius and military capacity Rome had decided it could not afford to tolerate indefinitely. What survived the burning? What persisted beyond the Roman province of Africa and the Roman city of Carthage that Julius Caesar founded on the ruins, and Augustus formally established a century after the destruction, is a testament to the specific durability of the things that civilizations carry at their deepest levels. The Punic language survived in the North African countryside for 5 centuries. The commercial networks that Carthage had organized persisted in altered forms under Roman administration, following the same routes between the same ports that Punic merchants had established. The harbour that Punic engineers had built continued to serve the city that replaced the city, adapted and modified, but fundamentally the same engineering achievement. And the alphabet. The Phoenician consonantal script that Carthage had inherited and used, and passed on through the communities of its diaspora, continued its ancient work of carrying human meaning from mind to mind, across whatever distance separated the writer from the reader. Hannibal's military legacy entered the Western military tradition through Scipio, who had learned from him, and through Scipio entered the Roman military system, and through the Roman military system entered every subsequent tradition of Western strategic thought. Military academies still teach Cannae. The envelopment that Hannibal executed on an African plain in 216 BCE is still the model that military planners study when they think about the complete tactical destruction of a larger force. He lost the war. He changed the way the world fights. The ruins of Carthage are still there beneath the suburbs of modern Tunis, the harbour basin holding its ancient shape, the Bursa Hill still rising above the bay, the stele of the Tophet still legible with the names of people who wanted the gods to know they had existed. The stone remembers when the text has burned. The sea between us and that vanished world is the same sea that carried Dido's ships to the African shore. The same sea that Hannibal crossed with his army and his elephants and his oath. The same sea that carried the Roman fleet to its final appointment, with a city that had made the ancient world what it was and that the ancient world could not. In the end, permit to survive. It does not distinguish between the civilizations that have used its shores. It was there before Carthage, and it remains after. Tonight, it is quiet.